Hi everyone, I'm Eli Lake, Washington Times New Republic, and I'm joined with Adam Serwer, the staff writer at the American Prospect and frequent contributor in the Washington Post's post-partisan Greg Sargent blog. Is that right?
It's the Plumb Line.
The Plumb Line, I'm sorry. The proud son of Daniel Serwer, one of my favorite diplomats, recent diplomats. So, how are you, Adam, on this Saturday? That's why I'm a little.
I'm good. I'm good.
Because it's a Saturday.
It's starting to get a little warmer. It's starting to be a little spring-like in Washington D.C.
Yeah.
So that's nice. The sort of bitter cold is going away.
Barbecues and Coronas. So let's start this off, and I ask this seriously: how are the progressives doing? How are you guys holding up? Because it's got to be a series of disappointments with the civil libertarian and war on terror issues of the Obama administration, right?
Yeah, I think when I think about it, it's interesting. Like, I feel like there have been these sort of protracted battles between civil libertarians and everybody else for a really long time. And when I think about it, it's funny that there's been so much. I mean, like, I've written about it a lot, but I think this was all decisively over, I think, in May of '09, and none of us really realized it. I mean, it wasn't really over.
I wrote it before then, but okay.
But like, I think, when.
But I'm not in the progressive tent, so to speak.
Well, no, but I mean, like, the KSM trial fight went on for a really long time. There were all sorts of, the Congress ultimately banned the administration from using federal trials to prosecute terrorists, which from Gitmo, which is like something that never would have happened during the Bush administration. I mean, like, things happened, but like the decisive sort of, are we really changing the course of the Bush post-2006 national security policy happened in May of '09. That was already decided. That was decided after the sort of political backlash to releasing the torture memos and the panic within the White House and Greg Craig being sidelined. And this is sort of everything we're seeing now, including the decision to try KSM and military commissions, is sort of just, almost afterbirth. Like, it's just the stuff. It's the stuff that's happening because this other stuff happened way long ago, and it's almost a delayed reaction. I still think that the truth is that the civil libertarians, especially on matters of trying terrorists, have it right on the merits, and the decision not to listen to them is going to cause some serious problems for the United States effort to incapacitate terrorists through the legal system.
Well, I don't understand that. What you don't think that there's any merit to the national security practitioners' argument that giving KSM a platform that could last for several years like that, could have the effect of radicalizing people, and from so much of the war, according to David Petraeus and others, is symbols, and it's almost a semiotic political war as much as it is a shooting war with drones and so forth. That giving KSM that kind of platform would be lead to these consequences. Maybe not for sure, but at least a series of these consequences that could present a real problem for the United States, not to mention the fact that so much of the evidence that was acquired on KSM and so forth, was acquired through intelligence means, so it would be difficult to process that in a court of law. Like, you know what I'm saying? And also, Adam, I guess finally, like, why does a Pakistani leader of Al-Qaeda deserve the same? I mean, is that really a test of our Constitution as it applies to U.S. citizens? You know what I'm saying?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that, the whole platform question, I think, is almost moot, right? Because right now, when the military commission started Gitmo, every major newspaper in the world is going to send someone there. So if we're saying, period, people are going to cover this, and therefore it's a platform for KSM, then that's going to happen regardless. But the point
I don't know that people join Al Qaeda because of Guantanamo. I don't think that's true.
Well, I mean, Petraeus has said that's true. I mean, Petraeus has said
Petraeus says a lot. I mean, I think Petraeus is. I mean, I think maybe there's a case to say on the margins that people will be less likely to help the United States against Al Qaeda and provide key information because they are concerned about the injustice of Guantanamo. But my sense of how the radicalization process works for someone who's going to really become like an Al Qaeda operative.
The way the radicalization process works, it's not a straight line. You don't just look at you don't see a picture of orange jumpsuits and become a terrorist. Like that's not how it works. But as far as the trial goes, I mean, this question of giving rights reserved for American citizens, the Constitution has always granted people rights regardless of whether they're citizens, as long as they're in our custody. And that's regardless of whether or not someone's a citizen. If
in World War II, people were in U.S. custody. They didn't have access to the same.
But that was different because we were fighting an actual uniformed military, and it was also different because KSM is not. He's not a warrior. He's not a soldier of any kind. And I don't think. I think. If you've ever been to like a federal trial, like federal judges don't mess around with people trying to. I have been. Well, I mean, like I'm just saying, sort of rhetorically, like federal judges don't mess around with people sort of trying to rant or trying to get on soapboxes. I mean, it would be. Afia Siddiqui, who is another Pakistani who was tried for wounding 2 American personnel in Afghanistan. She tried to sort of go on rants about Israel and stuff like that, and the judge just threw her out. I mean, you have to be present at the trial, but if you force the judge to throw you out, it's not a violation of your rights for them to continue without you. So I don't think that it would have been a platform for terrorism or would have radicalized anybody. To the contrary, I think it's actually a huge win for, a huge propaganda coup for Al Qaeda to be able to say, we scared the Americans out of using their own courts to try us. They're afraid of their own laws.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Israel does not try terrorists in military commissions. Pakistan does not try terrorists in military commissions. India does not try terrorists in military commissions. It's really weird that the United States is like so panicked about these people who are
it's not panic. There's a very serious issue. There's a very serious issue, which is that the method for obtaining evidence on these individuals, especially if we ask for our intelligence community to take a preventive posture as opposed to a law enforcement posture where they're trying to prosecute a crime after it's committed, is such that we don't want to that the U.S. government doesn't want to reveal the sources, methods, and other things of how they obtain that information. Now, my view is that eventually the adversary will catch up. As I always make this calculation as a journalist who covers national security, which is that eventually the adversary will find out how the U.S. government is figuring out ways to catch them. So we know that there are Al-Qaeda manuals, for example, that talk about the positioning of low orbital Earth satellites that are used to intercept sat phones, and that was from 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. So if in situations like that, I kind of feel like, well, all right, it only goes so far, and the government has an interest in sort of maximizing the amount of secrets that it wishes to keep. But I do think that's a real argument, particularly when you're talking about human sources. And instead of raising this question of, how do you deal with that procedurally in the U.S. court of law and creating all these exceptions, which may in fact create precedent for other things that I don't want it to create precedent for, why not just put it somewhere else, especially since the U.S. government takes it upon itself to try to kill terrorists all over the world. So they're not taking, Obama's clearly not taking the law enforcement approach despite what some of the Republican critics say. So if he's taking this preventive approach, he's using all these means and so forth, I just don't understand, I don't think we're losing that much if by not having it mucked around in civilian courts, or at least I think that's a valid argument.
Well, I understand the argument about being worried about disclosing intelligence, but here's the problem with that argument. The people most used to handling intelligence information as evidence are civilian prosecutors, U.S. attorneys, people like that. The people who, military lawyers generally try very small petty crimes because those are the ones that come up for court-martial.
Well, but
it's
now
actually,
we have a lot of people with experience who do this kind of terrorism cases. I mean, that's a little bit.
No. I mean, these kinds of military commissions didn't exist before the mid-aughts. There just simply are not as many military lawyers who have experience with trying these kinds of cases. That's not a knock on military lawyers. They're very talented people. But they're just not, they don't have the same amount of experience. And it's actually federal judges and not military judges who are more used to handling this kind of information. The idea that, and the military commission's procedures for handling classified information are based off of the procedures in civilian courts. So I think there's the only actual thing I can think of that was different about attending a military commission that might help in terms of hiding information is that there's a time delay in the courthouse at Gitmo. So if you're a reporter, they can shut down shut down the feed before you hear something that you're not supposed to hear. But that's the only thing. I mean, that's the only thing to recommend military commissions in terms of handling of intelligence information over federal courts. Federal courts would actually handle that kind of information better. And I understand why you're concerned about it. If you're concerned about it, I mean, that's the reason.
I'm not a lawyer, and a little bit outside of my area because I have not written about this particular aspect. But as I understand it, as I've heard from the other side, there are a lot of other vulnerabilities on that question of protecting it. And then there's a whole separate question of, do you want to start creating precedents in regular courts for, I guess, not disclosing certain kind of... I mean, I guess what they're saying is that there is a whole range of activities that I have no problem with the U.S. government doing in order to trap Khalid Sheikh Mohammed that, if applied to an American citizen, even the mafia or some other kind of crime, I would have a huge problem with. Does that make any sense? So what I don't want to see is the institutionalization of certain kinds of electronic surveillance. Now, that's not necessarily the case if I'm sure there's legal ways of trying to cordon it off in a civilian case for just sort of high-level terrorism or something like that. But one of the things I've noticed on an industry level, a little bit off topic, is that techniques that are useful in ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance in Afghanistan, are now being marketed and developed for local law enforcement. So things that, like in UAV technology, that allows you to sort of process lots of video images at once or something like that, which are used to help the drone attacks in Pakistan, are now being marketed on another degree to Montgomery County Police, and I just find that to be problematic, and I would like to see, and I'm wary about this parallel happening in the legal process as well. Does that make sense?
I think people, I think that's not a trivial concern at all. Okay. I mean, there are some people who have raised that issue, this question of whether or not trying terrorists will set these sort of extraordinary broad precedents in civilian court.
Yeah, we're dealing with secret evidence because I don't want secret evidence to become the norm in civil courts dealing with American citizens every day. On that point, I guess you could say I'm an ACLU liberal. Except I do want to make a distinction because I think that it's a preventive war against Al-Qaeda and other global terrorist groups or terrorists with global reach is fine. And so that's why I'd like to see the kind of distinction.
Well, I think that's not a completely trivial. I mean, it's definitely not a trivial question. There's a lot of other problems with using the commissions, though, which is that if you look at the unsealed indictment that Holder put out, I mean, what we're talking about here is these are mostly conspiracy charges, and conspiracy is not a recognized war crime. And what's going on now is you have two guys who are Salim Hamdan and Ali Bulul. And Ali Bulul is Salim Hamdan is Osama bin Laden's former limo driver, and Ali Bulul is sort of this really disgusting creature who did propaganda for Al Qaeda, and he was. And so both of them were convicted by military commission. Hamdan is home in Yemen, and Bulul boycotted is on trial, so he got a life sentence. But their lawyers are appealing their convictions because of the charges that they were tried with, which is material support and conspiracy. And there's a decent chance that we won't be able to use those two charges to charge people in military commission anymore.
Yeah.
And if that happens, that could happen, and it's going to the Supreme Court. And if that's the case, the military commissions are kaput anyway, because those are the sort of, I think Ben Witte said that described them as the bread and butter charges for terrorism cases. So, you could have a situation that you had, during the Bush administration, where the military commissions become useless, and what I want to see happen, honestly, what I would have liked to see happen was for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his pals to go to court. The case against them was very solid. They would have been convicted. They would have tried to appeal. The conviction would have been rock solid on appeal, and these guys would have all been executed. That would have been done. And now there's a chance that this could drag out for years, and that deeply bothers me. I think that it's time for these people. And generally, you're supposed to refer to these people as alleged conspirators, but I think these guys are guilty, and I think it's time for them to pay for it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's. I wanted to get to a broader point now on this point, which is almost a political one, and that is, it's not just Guantanamo. It's not just the military commissions. We saw this week, by the way, Secretary of Defense Bob Gates say probably going to have U.S. troops in Iraq longer. And I've talked to some military people who work on just the MNFI, and they say 20 to 30,000 past 2011. Another thing that I predicted, by the way. And so you're going to probably see the Iraqi government in some process ask for some sort of reserve force. Presence in Iraq, Guantanamo, another war without any kind of war resolution in Libya. This says nothing of extraordinary renditions, which we really can't track because they're done in secret, but we know from people's reporting, New York Times, myself and others, that it goes on, that there was a loophole in the original executive order. Not to mention all of the FISA, all of the kind of surveillance issues, which were huge under Bush. They still practice today with an amended FISA bill, and that's the Federal Intelligence Surveillance Act. Obama's not addressed that. We now hearing about, the FBI would like more authority. I'm saying all these issues that under Bush was there was a pretty rock solid, not just progressives, but Democrats, including Obama, who were a political bloc that said, on all of these issues, let's call them GWAT issues, global war and terrorism issues, everything ranging from the president's authority to make war and the executive branch's authority to make war to, specific kind of privacy rights and rule of law issues in this country on the whole approach to it. It appears that Obama is 90% caved on it. And I want to know from you, as somebody who I think is, one of the leading young lights of the progressives on this issue, how do you regroup at this point? Because he's the political leader, not just of the Democrats, but of the progressives, right?
Well, I don't think it's, I just try to tell people what I feel like my job is just to tell people what's going on. And I think that,
okay, I see that.
What's happened here?
I see your point. But it's okay for me to call you a progressive. Is that all right?
Well, no, I don't. I don't mind being. My perspective is from the left, and I don't mind acknowledging that to anybody who asks. But what I'm saying though is that I think you're right that there has been a sort of really almost absurd turnabout from the Democratic Party on these issues. I don't think that liberals have changed their minds so much. I think that the same people who are fighting Bush on this, the ACLU, the EFF, the Center for Constitutional Rights, they're still fighting Obama, and they're fighting just as hard as they were before.
Right.
And they're not going to stop fighting because Obama's in office. I think, it's certainly a great disappointment to them. I think they really... A lot of people in that community, I think, bought that Obama was serious about changing some of these things. I think in that Peter Baker New York Times piece, I think it says Anthony Romero said something to Obama like, I've never believed in a politician as much as I believed in you. Don't do this. And I think that at least that's what I think. I'm paraphrasing. I may be wrong, so I'll have to go back and look at it. But it was something like there's a lot of disappointment with the way Obama's handled this, and some of it I think gets really personalized among liberals. There are a lot of people who are really furious with Obama on this, and I just think that again I don't equate Obama's political caving on this with like him with like answering the question of whether or not these policies are correct on the merits. I think that
well, obviously,
I think that
I'm not assuming that just because
no,
Obama
but a lot of
says,
people for a lot of people that's all it takes.
What?
Yeah, no, but a lot of people that's all it takes. It's like Obama says it's okay. That means who. What's interesting, though, is that Jack Balkin, who, of course, his blog, Balkanization, was one of the, during the Bush years, was one of the best places to read, like, really interesting. And he wrote this post a long time ago that was basically, like, all this this stuff that liberals are angry about, this stuff with surveillance and with the rule of law, all of this is going to be ratified by the next president, no matter what party he's from, and that includes Obama, and he was just so right about that. And I think
he was right
what's really frightening about it is that what's going to happen is that these groups that fought Bush and fought Obama and are fighting Obama, they're going to become more and more of a kind of fringe. As like this becomes more, all these things that we do now that we didn't used to do become more broadly accepted, and I don't know, and I don't know what our society is going to look like as a result, but it certainly worries me.
Well, as I put out in a piece I wrote a year ago for Reason Magazine, the only hope for civil liberties, people concerned about civil liberties, of which I would consider myself as part of that larger Venn diagram, is to sunset all of the extraordinary powers and to re-debate it every few years. That's the only hope, because you're not going to be able to do it piece by piece and bit by bit. You're going to have to figure out a way to create a coalition that's right and left, but also not right and left fringe. You're going to have to get people who are in the center. And I think that, and if you had a serious kind of anti-secrecy reform in the intelligence and military budget, that would be the way to begin to kind of get a handle on it. But so far, I haven't seen it. There are legal strategies that the groups that you mentioned before have pursued against the government, but they've lost these cases, even in fairly sympathetic appeals court districts and so forth. So that's my sense. But I would imagine it's kind of demoralizing, because I just want to bring back to the political point, Adam, for a second. Do you remember? I remember in 2008, there was this sense before Obama was elected that the young cadre of writers that I've affectionately and somewhat derisively called the Juicebox Mafia, they had all the energy. They were meeting with young Democratic congressional candidates. It felt like that there was a kind of like new movement that was coalescing, and it's like not even 2 years. It's like it's a little more than 2 years later, Adam, and that moment and that movement seems completely gone. Am I wrong about that? It just seems like that new progressive dawn is over. I mean, it's not. It's still amazing if you kind of add it all up. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I think it's. I think that our politics moves pretty fast.
Yeah, it's true.
And just as it's also true that the left and the Democratic Party seemed pretty finished in 2004 too.
Yeah.
And then it came back in 2006. I feel like one of the interesting things is that the power changes hands. At least seems to change hands pretty quickly these days. I mean, perhaps more quickly than it did in the past. I mean, there was a really, really long period of Democratic Party dominance in the mid-20th century. And I think, like, we keep thinking that we're going to get back to that with one of the two parties, but I wonder if this sort of, like, one party gets in, does all this stuff.
Hold on. What you're saying, I totally agree with you about how the parties are going to, that's a very solid point. I'm not talking about the party, because the party contains multitudes, right? I mean, the Democratic Party supported, in the 1990s, and I'm not even talking about Clinton. I'm saying, like, there were, like, leaders of the Democratic Party that supported the Iraq Liberation Act. And then the Democratic Party, like, not even 5 years later, forgot about all of that, and then they supported other things. So that's the party and politicians. I'm talking about, though, like, the sense that the party is going to stand for a limitation of the federal executive's war-making abilities, a basic drawing a line on the, how much power and extraordinary power the president can wield in this global war on terror, thinking about creatively at a serious level, like when the war is over, and, these kinds of things where I'm just saying, and, like, by the way, with Libya, here's the prediction, okay? All the stuff about Blackwater and military contractors, if anyone's going to keep the peace in Libya, it's going to be Blackwater, well, not Blackwater, but because they're now XC, but it's going to be military contractors. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was Eric Prince. So I'm not saying I know that, but I'm just saying that's the clear thing. I mean, Spencer Ackerman's been doing very good reporting on that, about how that's going down. So, on all these issues that were, this is a progressive movement, and we are against these things, and we can do better. And the Democratic Party is going to be their vehicle for doing that. I'm just saying, on that issue set, is it going to come back in that form? And I don't know. It seems like it's over. I don't know, but I don't know.
I mean, I can't predict the future. I mean, I think what happened is pretty simple. I mean, there's no partisan incentive to stand up for those things now. I mean, when Democrats could tear down Bush by going after him on rule of law stuff, they could do that. I mean, it's a little like, there's something like that on the right now. I mean, this whole question of, accusing Obama of power grabs and blah, 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 blah. And there's this sort of, the right is saying a lot of the similar things that the left used to say about Bush, like using this this language of constitutional fidelity that, is more smoke than fire.
Well, on the war-making authorities, and all right, as far as the czars and, Van Jones and, Obama's obvious Islamist agenda to make us all gay, clearly, that's a different issue. But, there has been, listen, I listen to Mark Levin, not every night now, but I listen to him, fairly regularly to kind of keep track. He's made it very clear. He's not going to take the argument that, Glenn Greenwald makes about the War Powers Act and so forth. Okay, so they're not doing that. But on these other issues, or in terms of expansive executive and all the czars and so forth, yes, they made that argument from the beginning. And there is certainly a sense in politics of where you stand. I guess what I was observing was that the Bush's response to 9/11 and the Iraq War created what I thought was a new kind of politics that I thought was going to change the Democratic Party. I thought that soul of the Democratic Party was at stake in 2006 over the debate about withdrawing from Iraq and the surge. Okay, like I thought that debate, which inside the Democratic Party, the anti-war camp had won, and that it wasn't just the surge; it was a series of these other issues where it looked like the momentum was with that progressive caucus, and the Democratic Party had changed. And now it looks like that was just a mirage. And I don't want to belabor the point, and I'm not doing it like a kind of, I'm saying it's like kind of amazing, like, is that going to ever come back? I think the reason is because the top progressive, Barack Obama, did a little bait and switch, or when he became president, he was no longer a progressive, or he decided he wasn't on those issues.
Yeah, I think that's what happened. And I think, there are, we wouldn't be talking. I don't think Republicans would be so open about talking about withdrawing from Afghanistan the way that some House members are.
Right.
If McCain was in office, this is. There is. Yeah. But I think Democrats complain about party discipline, but Democrats have decent party discipline when it comes to shutting up about dear leader. And that's what we've seen happen with Obama.
Dear leader.
Well, sarcastically.
Oh, that's a weather vane. Note that, Blondie Heads viewers. Okay.
In any case, I think you're certainly right that there's that stuff was turned out to be disappointingly partisan.
You know who's consistently for? You know who's consistently for at least interventions of the Libya and Balkan and Iraq variety? Neoconservatives.
Yes,
consistently for.
I'm not a big fan of algorithms, ideological algorithms, especially when it comes to the use of military force. I mean, I'm the Libya thing. What worries me about the Libya thing is not, I understand the justification. You want to stop this. You want to stop Gaddafi, this crazy person, for doing something terrible. But like what we've seen, in Iraq and in Somalia is we intervene in order to prevent something terrible from happening, and in some cases, particularly in Somalia, something much, much worse happens than the thing we were there to stop.
I don't like that. I have a problem with that, but go on.
Well, what happened? There's no question. We went in there to stop the ICU, and now there's a former ICU guy running the government the way the ICU did, except he's got a brutal insurgency on his hands.
Are you talking about the Ethiopian intervention, or are you talking about the '93 intervention?
I'm talking about the Ethiopian intervention, not the '90s.
Yeah, well, the Ethiopian intervention stopped what would have been an ICU coup. The reason an ICU guy is now in charge of the transitional government is because he effectively defected. There's still like basically Al Qaeda linked, whatever you want to say. I consider them in the larger category of scumbag jihadists that are still threatening. They're in the middle. They're waging a civil war. They control lots of territory. At some point, they're going to have to be defeated. What's an interesting approach is that the Ethiopians came in and didn't stay. And you don't want to have an indefinite kind of occupation. Well, what really needs to happen in Somalia is somebody needs to basically spend a long period of time rebuilding the country's infrastructure and trying to kind of create the foundations for a real politics and also to do the kind of counterinsurgency. What's interesting is that...
But what's the evidence that we can do that? Or that anybody can do that? What's the evidence that can be done successfully in a country that hasn't had a government for decades?
There's a lot. Well, but that's the problem, is that people have tried to sort of manage that problem. Nobody's really tried to do it. But if I'm saying you're going to have a problem of
I think this is a little like...
You're going to have a base, at the very least, you can't, or at least the argument goes post 9/11, or maybe you want to argue otherwise, you can't allow for a base of territory like that, particularly as it's strategically located, as it is on the Red Sea. You can't have that controlled by effectively an Al Qaeda affiliate, because that would give.
But that's what it is now. Now that it wasn't like that before. It's like that now. We got what we didn't want to get because we were afraid of getting.
That's not exactly right, Adam. As I said, the ICU guy who heads the transitional government, which is weakened, obviously, he's defected. It's like saying the head of the Anbar Awakening is...
No, but Al-Shabaab controls most of the country, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Al-Shabaab controls most of the country. We have an Al-Qaeda affiliate,
right.
A strong Al-Qaeda affiliate, where it did not exist before.
At this point, I ask you, so in 2006, Al-Shabaab was threatening to take over the country. And Ethiopia intervened, and it turned out only delayed that. But you're saying if they hadn't intervened, that would have been good because then Al-Shabaab would have taken over the country more quickly? That doesn't make any sense.
No, Al-Shabaab didn't exist in its current form until the Ethiopian intervention.
Oh, that's pish-posh. Al-Shabaab did exist when Ethiopia...
Not as
they were somehow tamer. That's crazy talk. They were absolutely vicious thugs. They were still in this operational commanders were still the people who were connected to the 98 embassy bombings.
The ICU was, Somalia has a long, Al-Qaeda has a long, ugly history in Somalia, but Al-Shabaab, the force that it is now in East Africa, did not exist prior to the Ethiopian intervention.
There was an Islamic courts union. It had a paramilitary wing, and it was threatening to take over Mogadishu.
They were not nice people. They were not nice people, certainly. They were bad guys, but they weren't as bad as the bad guys that are there.
And I don't quite understand how you're getting that, because they were doing all the kinds of things that we don't want Islamic jihadist scumbags to do. They were confiscating like videotapes of Pretty in Pink. They were cutting off fingers of smokers and all these other bad things. Except now they're worse, more jihadi. I don't know. I mean, it's kind of like But
now there are more people dying.
In 2005 and 2006, they were. This argument that you and Farley and Iglesias have made, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Now there are more people dying than there were before, and not only are there more people dying than there were before, but
and all of this could have been prevented if we would have just let
going over there and blowing themselves up on behalf of Al-Shabaab because they're like, you have to come and help us defeat these. I mean, there were no American suicide bombers.
Okay. So wait a second. I think I understand your argument
before
now.
2006.
I understand the argument now. If we had just let the ICU win in 2006, we wouldn't have had this problem. Is that what you're saying?
If we had not intervened,
and just let them topple the transitional government and let the jihadist group.
They were already running the country. I mean, it wasn't a matter of. The transitional government was almost a non-entity at that point. I mean, they were already running the country.
Well, there was a genuine struggle for power. I'm saying you got to try to beat them back. I mean, or do you? I have no problem if you cut a deal with their political leadership that you think you can verify. I'm not saying you absolutely have to kill all of their leaders, but you can't. I think that you're downplaying what they were in 2006 when the Ethiopians invaded. And
I'm not saying they were good people. They were bad guys, but they're not as bad as the bad guys that are there now. Nor were they quite as frightening in terms of their
experience of the Ethiopian invasion, in your estimation, radicalized them and drove them closer to Al-Qaeda. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, it did that, but it also, it also turned them into this they were not. Al-Shabaab did not exist as it does now as this large military force that's going to take over the country. I mean, they were a faction within the ICU.
Oh, so the ICU the point is that in Libya, there were moderates, and that I don't know, man.
Well,
my CT guys, and I remember covering it. Okay, the situation was pretty dire. That was not pro-Western propaganda. There was a series of advances. I would say the Ethiopian invasion, of course, failed to prevent the bad guys from taking over, but they did delay it. And in that respect, the lesson of that is not don't go in Somalia and try to figure out some force to knock out the jihadists. It's once you've done that, then you need to work on the harder work of trying to strengthen the government that was trying to replace it. And by the way, there are efforts right now that I've been writing about with, basically bringing in contractors through XE and paid for by the UAE, the government of the UAE, to train on the ground a counterterrorism, counter-piracy force. And one of the reasons why Somalia is someone has to deal with Somalia is precisely because of the piracy problem that is part of it.
Right, but there's a lot of regional history, messed up regional history between Somalia and Ethiopia that exacerbated the backlash that was caused by intervention. My point is, when we go into these places and with good intention, sometimes we're really not we're really not careful about the kinds of problems we're going to create as a result. And that's what worries me about Libya, particularly considering that we seem to be backing a group that is not a military in any real sense and is probably not capable of dislodging the dictator that we are intervening to remove. And when that happens, and what's going to happen as a result of that? I mean, if there is another decade of prolonged suffering as a result of this sort of power struggle, whatever goodwill was engendered by the U.S. intervening to protect the rebels is going to turn into, people blaming the West for not dislodging Gaddafi completely or for not doing this or for not doing that. I mean, the West is going to get blamed for this. And my question is, what do we do when that backfires, if it backfires? And I don't see much evidence that this is going to go, this is going to go particularly well.
Well, I mean, I think Gaddafi surviving in power after all that and getting away with murdering tens of thousands in Benghazi and the massacre of that matter would have a terrible effect in the region, and that it would create basically a moral hazard. So what would stop Bashar Assad from doing the same thing?
But did invading stop the moral hazard? I mean, these guys are,
right now,
in Syria and Bahrain, they're just...
There's a bombing campaign, and there's intelligence operatives on the ground, probably a lot of contractors and stuff like that. But that's not quite the same as Operation Iraqi Freedom.
No, not at all.
Okay, so so there's a kind of intervention that clearly Obama has gone out of his way to try to hand off to NATO. The problem is that NATO can't do anything without American leadership. And, I think that in a situation like this, once you've made the decision to intervene, and I think it was eventually the right thing on humanitarian grounds, and also I think that there's all the consequences that you're talking about, sure, that's possible if there's a long, drawn-out occupation. But and so I'm not saying that there isn't a real concern, but there's also...
No, not an occupation, just an just like a long, prolonged civil war between these two factions that kills lots and lots of Libyans is going to be bad for us.
Well, the way that you try to avoid a civil war is by bringing more force to bear. I mean, how is it possible that Gaddafi's air force and collection of, African bully boy contractor mercenaries can, I'm not saying that you want to send the Marines, but there's all kinds of options in between. So, I mean, you figure out, and this is a hard question, especially since I haven't been to Libya, and I'm not there. Mm-hmm. So I would trust, I don't feel like I can really give you any kind of expert, but you have to eventually make a decision. How much force should be brought to decisively win the contest? And the problem, I think, has been that Obama and NATO have failed to figure out how much force they need to do, have tried to do so with the bare minimum, or are not even asking the right question. But they need to figure out how to best marshal so that it's not a drawn-out civil war. And it strikes me that, I don't know. So there you go.
But I mean, we brought lots of force in Afghanistan, and there's still a drawn-out civil war. I mean, the question, I'm not a pacifist. I don't think that America should never use force.
Right.
But what I'm saying is,
that's different.
I'm worried because I don't
different
see...
question than Libya, and I want to stop. Go on, but you can't make that comparison. There's a reason why there's a drawn-out civil war.
I'm just saying, where is the evidence that we
nothing to
can
do with
walk
the amount
into...
of force.
I mean, but the point is that, where's the evidence that we can walk into a country that hasn't had a functional civil society for decades and just make one happen?
Well, that's different. I don't think neither myself nor, I don't want to, you're putting me in a weird position because Libya is something I know far less about than Iraq or Afghanistan. But in Afghanistan, there's a very good reason why there's a drawn-out civil war, and that is because the people that were chosen to be the local governors and so forth in Afghanistan were some of the worst corrupt criminal scumbags that we could have found. And so over a period of time, the people that were representing the alternative to the Taliban actually ended up brutalizing and stealing from the population worse than the Taliban, giving them a political opening. Mm-hmm. And that's the reason why Afghanistan is the kind of morass that it is now, because of the failure to do good counterinsurgency in 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004. It was really, if you want to start, the problem goes back to the Bonn Conference and Zalmay Khalilzad. That said, all of that said, it's a different kind of problem. In Libya, I'm just saying, how hard can it be to utilize intelligence and aerial resources and other things to figure out how to best neutralize and encourage, the collapse of the Gaddafi regime. And then, you already have kind of an indigenous council of these groups. And at that point, have the international community kind of encourage them. It becomes a priority. But there's never, I don't think that anybody envisions sending huge ground forces into Libya to build civil society and
No, but we don't have to. But my point is, you know, you say I can't imagine it's that hard, but it looks like it's pretty hard because if we didn't, if we could do it,
Gaddafi,
we would have done it already.
I mean, first of all, you got in the case of Gaddafi, okay, you got a couple things, okay. You've got like Musa Kusa and other senior intel guys. Anyway, senior intel guys defecting
I'm
already,
just saying,
right? So you have the regime defecting, so that's good.
You have the regime falling apart. What I'm saying, though, is that I don't see people asking one question before we use force. And it's the question that I think we should always ask before we use force, having said that I'm not a pacifist, I'm not against America using military force to pursue its interest under certain circumstances. However, we should be asking, are we going to make this worse? And I don't think that question was asked before Libya, and I don't think it was asked before Somalia, and I think that there's not a lot of evidence in the past, and not a lot of good examples over the past 10 years.
Yeah, but I mean, in Libya, it happened so quickly.
Solving,
you've got to prevent Benghazi from getting blown up. That's what he said. I mean, I can't believe I'm the one. Obama's like, if we didn't act, he's like, if I didn't choose to act, then a city the size of Charlotte, North Carolina is going to be destroyed by this mad dog dictator who is talking about how he wants to kill his own people, and he was already willing to do that. People thought he was going to use his mustard gas that he still had, literally pour it out on the street and kill his own people. So in order to stop a humanitarian disaster, because America is still the world's #1 superpower, you got to pay the cost sometimes to be the boss. And that's one of the reasons, one of the moral reasons why America is superior and deserves to be in that pole position ahead of China and Europe and others, because we actually care about these kinds of things. Like, we don't want innocent people to be massacred. We'd like to see democratic institutions.
Well, which is it? Is it that we care about those kinds of things, or is it that we're superior? Because it can't be both.
Yes, of course it's both. That's the point.
It can't be both. Either we're doing it for the right reasons, or we're doing it because we're big and tough.
We're doing it in this particular case. I think it's clear we did it for humanitarian reasons. But there was one country that had the reach and the power to do something like that, to prevent this kind of massacre. It was the United States, and that's.
And what happens? And what happens if the ensuing power struggle dwarfs the amount? If the deaths in the ensuing power struggle dwarfs the amount of people who would have died in Benghazi, hypothetically, if Gaddafi had done what he might have done, and certainly he's someone with the capability.
Well, that's a fascinating what if.
What happens
and I'm sure, like, and whenever you're making moral calculations of this nature, you have to look at the sort of consequences, unforeseen consequences, and so forth. But I kind of think when you're faced with something like that,
but we don't. That's what I'm saying. Is like, I totally understand what you're saying about about wanting to prevent these people from dying. That is an honorable reason.
I think that's why Obama did it.
However,
it was the duty to protect. Right.
However, I don't think we ever really strongly consider the question of whether or not that will make it worse. I don't think we consider that question as a society. I don't think policymakers consider it enough. And I think it's really problematic because when you are as strong as the United States is, when you are the biggest dog on the block, you have to be careful. You have to be careful about how you use your strength. You just have to be.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. I think you got to consider that, but I just feel like that this is like real life. It's like real time events happening. And
exactly, but that's why I don't understand why people are glib about it.
Well, I don't think I agree with you. You shouldn't be glib about it, but I just feel that clearly Obama was reluctant to get involved for many reasons. The United States has an overstretched military right now. With the collapse of President Saleh in Yemen, I think there's clearly that's one of the reasons why Gates said you need to stay in Iraq for a while. You've got all these other problems that you have to worry about, and Libya is kind of like regionally, politically, and for a lot of other reasons, is not really the top of the list when you look at the wave of instability in the Middle East. But at the same time, I think that Obama probably made the right decision because of all the things that we do know, which is, one, he would have killed tens of thousands of people in a massacre in Benghazi. Two, if he would have gotten away with that, it would have been in some ways a moral hazard that would encourage other dictators to use massive force to put down their own demonstrations, which is something that I don't think is in America's interest.
I don't know that moral hazard it doesn't exist with our intervention in Benghazi. I mean in Libya, there's. It's not like it hasn't stopped Assad in Syria.
Well, hold on, wait a second. Assad has not done anything comparable to Gaddafi yet.
Not yet, but it certainly hasn't stopped him.
Yeah, I know he's killed a lot of people. My last blog had...
No dictator is going to think to himself, I'm not willing to kill a few people to keep power.
It's not a few people.
Of course they're going to do it.
But yes, I agree. They killed
Benghazi was not a few people. I know what you're going to say.
Different. What Gaddafi had done and was about to do than what
was willing to
Assad is doing right now.
Was willing to
in the revolting cities in Syria. Now, I think what Assad is doing is terrible, and I think that it's time for maybe the U.S. to consider something more pressure, like trying to freeze the guy's asset, or putting out a list of senior Syrian officials who wouldn't be allowed to travel in Europe or the United States. There are things that you do before bombing someone along those lines. But I just feel like you can't make that comparison because, and it does seem that. And Gaddafi was very clear. He was saying, and he telegraphed what he was going to do as well.
You're not going to get an argument from me. Gaddafi
but I'm saying that you would agree that the carnage in Libya was on a completely different level than anything we'd seen so far in the Arab Spring. It was it was on a different level, right?
But it was also it was also literally a civil war. I mean, it's not. It was also not. It's not like what happened in Egypt with people with people opening fire on unarmed protesters. This was a battle between two groups of essentially two factions in a civil war.
Yeah, I'm not.
It's not the same as.
We don't know that. You're saying it's really tribal and it's really this tribe against that tribe. Maybe that's what it's going to turn out to be, but I don't think that was what it was. What started this off? What started this uprising was the same.
No, we were hoping. I mean, what would have been good, the ideal situation, would have been the rebels not getting routed and getting pushed back to Benghazi, would be if they had come in and won, and we would have had to do nothing. That would have been the ideal situation, and that was what was happening prior to intervening in Benghazi, before. Intervening to stop a massacre in Benghazi before Gaddafi turned the tide. There was this chance that the rebels were actually going to succeed. I mean, that's a civil war.
Okay.
When one group of people with guns goes and tries to kill the current people in charge who all have guns, that's a civil war. I mean, maybe that's a little colloquial, but
it's not. Well,
I mean, that's what's happening.
It didn't start as a civil war. It started as a democratic uprising. And then that's the first thing. And the second thing is that it's not a civil war in the sense it's not a civil war in the sense of it's this tribe versus that tribe necessarily, because there's a coalition of tribes. It seems like from best we can tell, the majority of Libyans want to get rid of Gaddafi. And one of the reasons we know that is because Gaddafi had to augment his forces that were defecting at first with these African mercenaries. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's the sense that it's two armed camps fighting each other. It is a civil war, but it's not a civil war in the sense that it's like North versus South, or in the Yemeni civil war, where it really was these kind of tribal confederations that were arrayed against each other. It may devolve into that. We certainly hope it doesn't. But at first, it was a democratic uprising met with indiscriminate and escalating force that the United States decided to intervene in after it looked like the rebels would be completely defeated in Benghazi at great cost in human life. Mm-hmm. And that, yes, preventing that action may end up creating a civil war down the line, and certainly can't deny it, but I think that the costs in the immediate term were great enough where the decision was justified. And I think that Obama hit the tone right on the head in his speech explaining this to the United States as to why he did it. And I kind of just, on that point, I just feel like it was classic liberal interventionism. It was just a classic duty to protect. I mean, the only point that I would make is that the same arguments for the Libya intervention would apply to supporting the surge in Iraq in 2006 and 2007, or 2007, I should say, just because there was a similar, like if the United States followed the Baker-Hamilton plan, we would be sure that there would be mass casualties for different reasons. It was not like you were fighting one individual, but that so that the same kind of duty protect would have applied to the surge, though not the initial Iraq war. But that's kind of a separate point.
I really hope that it's right. I really hope that this works out. I hope this turns out a lot better than Somalia turned out. And I hope that we don't have a situation where.
Do you really think that it's like the same as Somalia? I mean, like it's just how is it the same as Somalia?
No, I don't think it's the same. I don't think it has to. I mean, like they're two completely different countries. Okay. No, it's not the same. But like what we're talking about is what we've seen like is, you know, when Bush supported the Ethiopian intervention in 2006, you know. He could not have possibly imagined that trying to prevent a sort of Taliban in East Africa was going to lead to, you know, teenagers from Minnesota blowing themselves up in Somalia. Like, he could not have imagined that. And we don't think about, you know, like we say, we talk about this stuff and we're like, you know, this is a really good, we have to save these people from being killed. And like that's a really
not the reason
honorable
why
reason
the
to intervene, but we never.
Back the Ethiopian invasion was a good one. I mean, the reason that was a good one is because as I said, you delayed what's happening now. You delayed this crowd taking over the country. That was a bad thing.
I don't think we did that. I think what we did was we made that crowd even worse than they were prior.
I call this like the kind of Aristotelian theory of international relations, which is that there is one kind of first mover, and that is the United States, and everything is kind of a reaction to that. And I just don't. I kind of.
No, I don't think it's a reaction to that. I don't think it's like, oh, we intervene so they hate us. I mean, like, the truth is like what's interesting about their ability to recruit Americans is that, you know.
And by the way, you don't. How do you know? By the way, that if the ICU had been allowed to take over, that you wouldn't have seen the recruitment in Minneapolis, as you said. I mean, that's actually a great way to end it because we can talk about radicalization. Because there wouldn't have been a war to fight. I mean, like when if you look at the transcripts from the Minneapolis case, they're talking about like you have to go and protect. You know, these outsiders are killing us. You have to go and protect, and like we're going to get you a wife. We're going to get you such. It's sort of like, you know, child molesters in an AOL chat room circa 1993, right? I mean, these are sick people, but there just would not have been, you know, there would not have been this open sore that was drawing conflict that was drawing people there. How do you know? This is my thing. Okay, you're dealing with an ideology, a group of people inspired by an ideology that has proven to be warlike and rapacious pretty much from the get-go. So people who are hardcore jihadists, I'm not even talking about mainstream political Islam, I'm saying like the Qaeda, Saudi-based variety, have proven that pretty much everywhere they go, they want perpetual war, and they want to expand the edges of Dar al-Islam. And so I don't know that there's a guarantee that if you just let the ICU run the table in Somalia, they would just be content and there wouldn't be a war. I think there would be a war, and they would maybe be a war, you know, on the edges of Somalia in other areas. And we would have just seen kind of continue. And you just don't want to give those people control of important port cities and the ability to launch attacks and potentially disrupt major shipping. So those are the reasons why the counterterrorism war planners in the Bush administration were like, we need to do something. And then fortunately, like the Ethiopians volunteered to do the kind of work that now it appears the UAE is bankrolling, and the Saracen contractors are, you know, performing over there. But someone's got to go in there and, like, you know, clean up the neighborhood. Someone's got to do it. I mean, I'll even concede your point that maybe Ethiopia is not the best cleaned up.
Did this clean up the neighborhood? Yeah. I mean, like, as it stands, these neighborhoods look pretty unclean to me.
Yeah, no, they don't look good now. But yes, you're right. I mean, I'm not denying that that Shabab lunatics have established themselves very much and are winning a war in Somalia right now. What I'm just saying is that efforts to try to prevent them from doing so earlier in 2006 were not in vain. I'm just, it delayed it. I mean, it was inadequate. It was inadequate. It wasn't the cause of the radicalization.
I think that what's interesting to me is that the Al-Qaeda has a really difficult PR problem, which is that people don't really like them because they kill lots of Muslims.
Lots of Muslims.
The one thing that these lots and lots of Muslims, they kill lots and lots of Muslims, and people. They sometimes have a hard time getting people to join up with them for that reason. But the one thing that they tend to, the real hook for some of these like impressionable young people who are like looking for an identity, looking for some kind of glory, is that they tell them, look, there's this war over here where your cousins are dying, people you care about are dying, people that you have, a duty to protect, so to speak, and they bring them over. And I believe that it should be it is in the U.S. strategic interest to bring as many of these types of conflicts to a close, because the longer they exist, the easier of a time these people are going to have trying to convince these sort of messed up, lonely young people to.
All right, let me offer the counter, and then we should perspective. The counter to that argument is that when Al-Qaeda does control the state, or effectively has a host that is letting them operate in the state, you have pre-9/11 Afghanistan or Sudan of the 1990s. So what you want to avoid is for Al-Qaeda to have a situation where they feel secure and comfortable enough where they can have training camps and plan out operations and continue to sort of make money. So what you want to, it's not a bad idea. I see your point about how conflict is one of the things that people can kind of recruit to. And that's certainly a concern, and I think that you can handle that question, at least in terms of the U.S. and other places, through counter-radicalization, offering alternatives by having a more vigilant groups inside the community who will alert the FBI and so forth about it. But the one thing that you don't want to do is you do not want to allow Al-Qaeda to have safe havens again, because when they have safe havens, I think that unless you reach some sort of entente with them, they will prove that they will attack. They will try to aim for mass casualty attacks in the West, and in that respect, it's important to make sure that they are constantly, feeling the brunt of firepower, and that they don't have peace, so to speak, where they sleep. Right?
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I would counter that, but I think we're running out of time, so we'll just have to argue with you about
Good
that.
Good stuff, Adam. We didn't talk about my scoop. The Israelis have a global war on terrorism against Hamas, just like the U.S. global war on terrorism.
Next time.
All right. Bye, Adam.
Next time.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Eli.
Bye.
Take care.